He almost walked away, not because the feelings disappeared, not because you meant nothing, but because holding on had started to frighten him, and that is where the symbolism of the Four of Pentacles becomes important. Look at this card. The figure is holding something close to her chest, almost protecting it, almost afraid that if she loosens her grip for even 1 second, something precious could be lost. Psychologically, this card can represent guarded emotions, fear of vulnerability, and the instinct to protect what matters most. And for this part of the story, that is exactly where he was. He was trying to control what he felt for you. He told himself distance would make things easier. He tried to keep his heart contained. He tried to reason with emotions that refused to disappear. But here is where everything changed. A dream interrupted that emotional wall. In the dream, something about you felt familiar again. Maybe it was your face, maybe it was your voice, maybe it was simply the feeling of peace connected to your presence. Whatever the image was, he woke up with an emotion he had been trying not to feel. Longing, and suddenly, walking away no longer felt like freedom, it felt like losing something. Now listen carefully, because this is the first major shift. The Four of Pentacles does not have to mean someone is coming back, and it is not being used here as fortune-telling. Instead, it symbolizes the inner conflict of someone who wants to protect themselves while also protecting a connection they still value. That dream forced him to confront the question he had been avoiding. Why am I still holding this person in my heart if I truly want to let go? And somebody watching may understand that tension. Sometimes the strongest emotions are not the ones people express, they are the ones they keep locked away. Joel 2:28 reminds us that Scripture contains moments where dreams become meaningful experiences. In this story, the dream becomes the moment where suppressed emotion rises to the surface. But the dream did not give him every answer. It did something more powerful. It made him stop running long enough to ask the question he had been afraid to ask. And what he realizes next changes the entire direction of this story. Because distance had revealed what his defenses were trying to hide. It had not made the connection disappear, it had made him notice its absence, and that difference matters, because he expected space to quiet everything down. He thought fewer conversations would mean fewer feelings. He thought time apart would make you less present in his mind, but ordinary moments kept proving otherwise. A quiet evening, a song he had heard before, something funny he instinctively wanted to tell you. A moment when life became heavy and he remembered how it felt to talk to someone who understood him without requiring a long explanation. And that is where the Nine of Pentacles becomes important. Look at this card. The figure appears surrounded by abundance, standing in her own space, reaching upward, while a bird moves freely beside her. Psychologically, the Nine of Pentacles can symbolize independence, self-possession, and the ability to stand securely within your own life. It does not mean someone is destined to return, but within this story, it reveals something he had not expected. Distance showed him that you were not simply someone he had become accustomed to having around. You had a life of your own, a presence of your own, and the farther away he became, the more clearly he could see what your presence had actually added to his life. Now pay attention to this. Because sometimes people say they need space when what they really need is relief from the intensity of what they are feeling. And for him, those two things had become confused. He believed he was protecting his peace. But part of what he was protecting himself from was the realization that you mattered enough to affect him. And somebody listening knows exactly what that feels like. You can remove someone from your daily routine. You can stop hearing their voice. You can stop seeing their name appear on your screen. But none of that automatically removes the place they occupied emotionally. That was what the distance exposed, and the dream gave that realization a shape. It took feelings that had been appearing quietly throughout his days and brought them together in one experience he could no longer dismiss so easily. He woke up missing you, but that was not the part that unsettled him most. Because when he finally stopped calling it simple loneliness, he realized there was something very specific he missed. It was not merely having someone there. It was the way he felt when it was you. And once he understood exactly what that feeling was, the dream began to mean something very different. Because what stayed with him was not necessarily every detail of the dream, it was the feeling. He may not have remembered every place, every word, every image, but he remembered what it felt like to be near you again. Calm, familiar, almost relieved, as if, for a moment, he did not have to analyze what he was feeling or protect himself from it. And that is where the symbolism of the Six of Wands becomes important. Look at this card. The figure is standing with her arms raised, almost allowing herself to be seen, while the wand beside her carries a wreath. Psychologically, the Six of Wands can represent recognition. Not necessarily recognition from other people. Sometimes it is the moment when you finally acknowledge something within yourself that you have been denying, and that is what was beginning to happen here. The dream did not need to be dramatic to affect him. It did not need some extraordinary sign, because while he was awake, he had been doing everything he could to stay in control, analysing, questioning, pulling back, trying to decide what was reasonable and what was too risky. But in the dream, that resistance was quiet. For a few moments, he simply experienced your presence without arguing with himself about what it meant. And when he woke up, that contrast stayed with him. Now listen carefully. Dreams can sometimes bring emotions into awareness that people have pushed aside during waking life. That does not automatically make every dream a prediction, and it does not mean every image carries a supernatural message. But for him, this one felt meaningful because of what remained after it was over. Peace. That was the part he could not explain away so easily. Because if letting you go was really bringing him peace, why did imagining life without you feel heavier? And why did remembering your presence feel like relief? That question followed him. Not because the dream told him what would happen next, but because it showed him something about what was already happening inside him. And somebody listening may understand this. Sometimes you do not realize how guarded you have become until you remember what it felt like not to be guarded. That was the recognition. The Six of Wands, in this story, becomes the moment he finally sees what his defenses had been covering. He did not only miss your voice. He did not only miss your attention. He missed the version of himself that existed when he felt understood. The version that did not have to calculate every emotion. The version that could soften. The version that could hope. And suddenly, the dream was no longer only reminding him of you. It was reminding him of who he had been when he felt safe enough to love you. And that realization was more uncomfortable than he expected, because loving you had not only changed how he felt about you, it had changed how he experienced himself. Around you, there were moments when he did not have to be so guarded. He could care without immediately questioning why. He could imagine something lasting, without calculating every possible way it might fall apart. He could be softer, more honest, more open to hope. And for someone who had learned to feel safer through control, that kind of openness could become frightening. That is where the symbolism of the King of Swords becomes important. Look at this card. The figure appears thoughtful and composed, surrounded by symbols of observations and awareness, with the sword close beside him. Psychologically, the King of Swords can represent logic, mental control, and the desire to understand emotion before allowing emotion to influence a decision. And there is nothing wrong with thinking clearly. But sometimes thinking becomes a defense. Sometimes a person analyzes what they feel because simply feeling it makes them vulnerable. That was the conflict becoming clearer here. The Four of Pentacles showed the instinct to hold everything tightly. The King of Swords shows another way that same protection can appear. Through the mind. He could explain why distance made sense. He could list the risks. He could remember every complication. He could convince himself that being detached was the more reasonable position. But the dream had taken him somewhere reasoning could not completely control. And what he encountered there was not chaos. It was peace. Now pay attention to that. Because part of what frightened him was realizing that he had begun associating vulnerability with danger, even when the connection itself had also brought something good out of him. Walking away might protect him from uncertainty, but it would also protect him from tenderness, from hope, from being emotionally known, and suddenly he understood that he was grieving more than the possibility of losing you. He was grieving the version of himself that had begun to emerge around you. The version that believed love could be safe enough to receive. The version that did not always need an escape route. And somebody listening may understand why that realization could make a person pull back even harder. Because once you see that fear has been influencing you, you have to decide whether you are willing to face it. And he was not ready yet. His next reaction was not to move toward what he felt. It was to fight it, because accepting what the dream had revealed would mean admitting something he had spent a long time trying to deny. So he tried to explain it away. Maybe it was only nostalgia. Maybe stress had brought old memories to the surface. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe his mind had simply taken something familiar and turned it into a dream. And for a while, those explanations helped him feel more in control. He stayed busy. He filled the quiet spaces. He avoided anything that might pull his attention back toward you. And when memories appeared, he countered them with reasons. Reasons it had been complicated. Reasons distance seemed safer. Reasons reopening those feelings might only create more confusion. But here is where the resistance started working against him. Because the harder he tried to remember why he should let go, the more he remembered why he had cared. And that is where the symbolism of the Ace of Wands becomes important. Look at this card. There is a flame at the center. Something alive, something difficult to ignore. Psychologically, the Ace of Wands can symbolize a spark returning to awareness, an impulse, a feeling that had not disappeared even when someone tried to suppress it. Again, this does not mean the card predicts what he will do, and the dream itself does not have to be treated as automatic divine instruction. But within this story, both symbols point toward the same emotional problem. Something he thought was fading was still alive, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to keep interrupting him. He would remember the way you listened when he was trying to explain something difficult, the ease of an ordinary conversation, a moment when you noticed something about him that other people overlooked, nothing spectacular. And somehow, those were the memories that carried the most weight, because they were harder to dismiss as fantasy. They had happened in the small spaces, the places where people usually reveal what a connection actually feels like. Now listen carefully. The more he fought those memories, the more obvious it became that he was not only resisting you, he was resisting what being close to you awakened in him. And that was why the dream continued to bother him, not because he could prove where it came from, but because he could no longer deny what it exposed. Then one particular memory came back, and this one was different, because when he looked at it honestly, he finally saw that the reason he almost walked away had never been as simple as timing. It was not only distance, it was not even incompatibility. He had almost walked away because the connection had reached a place where losing it could truly hurt him, and that was the fear underneath everything. Not simply losing you, but allowing himself to care enough that losing you would matter. Because once someone becomes important, they also become capable of hurting you. Not necessarily because they intend to, but because love creates exposure. And for someone who had learned to protect himself by staying emotionally controlled, that exposure could feel dangerous. That is where the symbolism of the moon becomes important. Look at this card. The imagery feels dreamlike, uncertain, almost as if something hidden beneath the surface is beginning to reveal itself. Psychologically, the moon can symbolize fear, uncertainty, projection, and the emotions that become harder to understand when we cannot see clearly. And in this position, it can suggest that something previously hidden is starting to come into awareness. That is exactly what was happening to him. He had been telling himself that distance was about being practical, about avoiding complications, about protecting his peace. But beneath those explanations was another thought. What if I let myself fully love this person and then lose her? And sometimes people try to answer that fear before life ever gets the chance. They leave first, they detach first, they create distance while they still feel some sense of control, because choosing separation can feel less frightening than waiting for separation to choose you. Now listen carefully. Understanding that does not excuse the way someone handles a relationship. Fear can explain behavior without making every behavior acceptable. But in this story, it finally explains the contradiction. Why would someone who still cared begin pulling away? Because the connection had become important enough to activate the very fear he was trying to avoid, and this is where the dream challenged him. While awake, his mind kept showing him everything that could go wrong: rejection, disappointment, loss, being known deeply and then being hurt. But the dream showed him something else, not what he might lose someday, what he was already losing by staying afraid. The peace he associated with you, the openness he had experienced around you, the possibility of loving without constantly preparing for the ending. And suddenly his protection did not feel quite as protective anymore. It felt costly, because fear had been making decisions that he had been calling wisdom. And that realization changed the question. Maybe the dream was not telling him what would happen between you. Maybe it was not telling him to chase anyone. Maybe it was asking him to confront something much closer. What if the dream was forcing him to face the fear that had been making his decisions for him? And that question required a different kind of honesty. Because if fear had been making some of his decisions, then he could no longer assume every impulse to leave was wisdom. But he also could not assume the dream meant he should immediately come back. There had to be discernment. And that is where the symbolism of the Eight of Pentacles becomes important. Look at this card. The figure is seated at a table, focused on what is in front of her. There is attention here. Patience, the willingness to examine something carefully instead of rushing toward an answer. Psychologically, the Eight of Pentacles can represent intentional effort, reflection, and the process of learning through careful attention. And that is exactly what this moment required from him. Not another reaction, not another escape, a closer look, because a meaningful dream does not always arrive with a complete explanation. Sometimes the meaning is found in what it causes you to examine afterward. And within a Christian understanding, discernment matters. Not every strong emotion is automatically direction. Not every fear is automatically a warning. And not every dream should be treated as a command. Sometimes the wiser response is prayer, honesty, self-examination, asking whether what you feel is leading you toward truth or simply reinforcing what you already wanted to believe. That was the work beginning inside him. He started asking questions he had avoided before. Was I leaving because this connection was truly wrong, or because being this close to someone frightened me? Was I protecting my peace or protecting my pride? Was I responding to wisdom or reacting to fear? Now listen carefully. Those questions changed something. Because before the dream, his attention had been almost entirely focused on you. What you might do, what you might feel, whether you might hurt him, whether the connection could fail. But now his attention was turning inward, toward his own motives, his own defenses, his own responsibility, and that made the dream more meaningful, not less, because instead of giving him an excuse to chase a fantasy, it was forcing him to become more honest about himself. The Eight of Pentacles, in this story, becomes the willingness to do that inner work carefully, to separate longing from conviction, fear from wisdom, hope from projection. And eventually, all of those questions narrowed into one. A question he could not avoid by staying busy. He could not answer it in logic alone. And he could not blame the dream for whatever answer came next. If fear were removed from the equation, what would he actually choose? He did not answer that question immediately, because once fear was removed, other things had to be removed too. Pride, old disappointments, the imagined conversations that had never happened. The worst-case scenarios he had rehearsed so many times that they started feeling like facts, and underneath all of that, something much simpler remained. He still cared, not because the dream created a feeling that had disappeared, but because the dream brought his attention back to a feeling he had been trying to bury. And that is where the symbolism of the Two of Cups becomes important. Look at this card. Two hands are reaching toward each other. There is connection here, mutuality, the willingness to meet rather than remain completely separate. Psychologically, the The Two of Cups can symbolize emotional openness and the recognition that meaningful connection requires participation from both people. It does not guarantee reconciliation. It does not mean two people are destined to reunite. But in this story, it represents the truth he could no longer hide from himself. There was still love underneath the fear. And that distinction matters, because the dream did not suddenly make him love you again. It made him recognize that he had never completely stopped. He had covered the feeling with distance, with reasoning, with self-protection, with every explanation that made walking away seem easier than admitting how deeply the connection affected him. But once those defenses became visible, they could no longer pretend to be the feeling itself. Fear was fear, love was love, and he was beginning to understand the difference. Now listen carefully. Recognizing love is not the same as knowing what to do with it. Longing alone does not repair anything. Missing someone does not automatically create a healthy relationship, and private emotion means very little if it never becomes honesty, responsibility, or some willingness to face reality. That was the next uncomfortable truth. Because if he truly cared, he could not stay hidden forever and expect the connection to remain exactly where he left it. Time had been moving for you too. You had your own life, your own healing, your own questions, and perhaps your own boundaries. The Two of Cups may symbolize connection, but connection still requires two people willing to meet, honestly. And suddenly he faced a fear, even greater than admitting he still loved you. What if he finally found the courage to stop hiding? Only to discover that while he was deciding whether to come closer, you had already learned how to live without waiting for him. And that possibility changed everything. Because before, he had been afraid of what loving you might cost him. Now he was beginning to understand what avoiding love might have already cost. That is where the symbolism of the devil reversed becomes important. Look at this card. The devil can represent attachment, fear, unhealthy patterns, and the invisible things that keep someone repeating the same behavior, even when that behavior no longer serves them. Reversed, the symbolism can point toward recognizing those patterns and beginning to loosen their hold. Not because everything suddenly becomes easy, but because what was controlling you is finally being seen. And in this story, that is exactly where he was. He could finally see the pattern, feel deeply, become afraid, pull away. Tell himself the distance was necessary, then miss what he had pushed away. And repeat. But now there was something he could not ignore. You were not required to remain in the same place while he worked through that cycle. You were allowed to heal. You were allowed to grow. You were allowed to decide what you would and would not accept. And somebody listening needs to hear that without turning it into a prediction. Loving someone does not mean putting your life on hold indefinitely. Hope does not require abandoning your boundaries, and his awakening does not create an obligation for you. That realization humbled him. Because if he chose to move toward you now, he could not come with entitlement. He could not expect the connection to resume exactly where he left it. He would have to come differently. With honesty, with responsibility, with the willingness to acknowledge what fear had caused him to avoid, and with enough respect for you to accept that your response was still yours to make. Now listen carefully. This is why the dream affected him so deeply. It did not simply remind him that he missed you. It showed him the emotional consequence of continuing to let fear make his choices. Every time he protected himself from vulnerability, he also moved farther away from the connection he claimed to value, and eventually, protection can become its own kind of loss. The devil reversed, in this story, represents the moment he begins to understand that freedom is not always walking away. Sometimes freedom is no longer being controlled by the fear that made you want to run. And now he has reached the point where awareness is no longer enough. He knows what has been rekindled. He knows what he has been avoiding, so the choice becomes painfully simple. Return to the safety of silence, or become honest about what is still alive in his heart. And this time, silence no longer felt neutral. It felt like another decision, another way of letting fear choose for him. And that is where the symbolism of the Eight of Cups becomes important. Look at this card. The figure is walking forward, leaving something behind. Psychologically, the Eight of Cups can represent emotional departure, but it can also represent the moment when someone realizes they can no longer remain in an emotional pattern that has stopped being honest, and for him, that is the deeper meaning here. He had spent so much time thinking that walking away from you was the brave choice, the mature choice, the safer choice. But now he could see that there was another kind of walking away he needed to consider. Walking away from fear. Walking away from the habit of disappearing when something mattered too much. Walking away from the belief that emotional control was the same thing as peace. Now listen carefully. This card does not guarantee that he sends a message. It does not promise that two people reunite, and the dream does not remove anyone's freedom to choose what happens next. But within this story, something has changed permanently. He can no longer tell himself that the love was gone. He can no longer call avoidance certainty, and he can no longer pretend that leaving was entirely about what was wrong with the connection. Some of it was about what the connection awakened inside him. That was what the dream brought back into awareness. Not a fantasy, not a guarantee, a truth he had been avoiding. He still loved you, and with that realization came something else, courage, not the kind that demands an outcome, the kind that is willing to be honest without controlling the response. If he speaks, he has to speak differently now, without pretending nothing happened, without expecting you to erase your own hurt, without assuming that because he finally understands himself, you must immediately understand him too. He has to take responsibility for what fear made him avoid, and then he has to allow you the dignity of your own choice. That is what makes this different. The dream may have felt spiritually significant to him, but meaning does not remove human responsibility. Sometimes what feels like a moment from God does not tell you exactly what will happen. Sometimes it simply brings light to the place where fear has been hiding, and once you see that clearly, you have to decide who you are going to become. He almost walked away from love, because he thought distance would protect him. Instead, distance showed him what he was protecting himself from admitting. The feeling never truly disappeared, it was buried beneath fear. And now, whether the next chapter becomes reconciliation or simply honest closure, one thing is different. Love is no longer hiding behind fear, and neither is he.